Welcome back, everyone. Okay, if you're the kind of learner who loves dissecting complex history with crystal clarity, you are absolutely in the right place. Today's explainer is going to completely challenge some deeply ingrained assumptions we all have about the global timeline, specifically that heavily Eurocentric view dominating so many of our textbooks. We're going to deconstruct the myth of the Dark Ages and explore the incredible, highly centralized engine of the Abbasid Caliphate.
All right, let's dive right into this. When did the Roman Empire actually fall? Now, if you took a standard Western Civ class, you probably have a very specific date etched into your brain. You were likely taught that Rome fell and boom, the world was plunged into a 1,000-year period of intellectual darkness. But what if the fundamental premise of that entire narrative is just completely wrong?
So the myth, often cited by older historians, points to September 4th, 476 AD. But let's look at what actually happened that day from a critical perspective. The Western Roman Emperor essentially just abdicated, packed up his purple robes, and sent them over to the Eastern Roman Emperor. He basically said, hey, we only need one emperor now. Obviously, that is not the collapse of an entire civilization. The historical reality is May 29, 1453. That is when the Roman capital, Constantinople, actually fell to Ottoman soldiers, and the state completely ceased to own any real estate. We're talking almost a 1,000-year difference here. If Rome didn't collapse when we're told it did, well, the whole concept of the Dark Ages really starts to unravel.
Think about it. We're taught that Western civilization was born on the banks of the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile. But then, almost magically, the narrative just jumps exclusively over to Greece and Rome. The standard timeline completely ignores the Middle East after ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, basically pretending civilization just vanished from the East. It's a massive geographical contradiction. I mean, how could a civilization born in the East suddenly disappear from it, while a supposedly dark age blanketed the West? The truth is, the light of innovation never went out. It just centralized somewhere else.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Abbasid Golden Age.
So by the mid-8th century, the ruling Umayyad Caliphate was expanding, sure, but they were getting increasingly unpopular. In 747 CE, a guy named Abu Muslim launched a massive revolt out on the eastern frontier. This was a huge coalition of Arabs, Persians, and Central Asians, all rallying under the black banners of the Abbasid family, and it spread like wildfire. Just 3 years later, in 750 CE, at the Battle of the Zab, the Abbasids completely routed the Umayyad army. They hunted down the ruling family and seized total control. To really lock in this new centralized power, in 762, they founded a brand new capital right on the Tigris River, Baghdad, the City of Peace.
Now, to run a massive empire stretching all the way from Central Asia to North Africa, the Abbasids needed a serious bureaucratic engine. At the very top, you have the Caliph. This was the absolute supreme spiritual and political authority. But right below him, they created the role of the vizier, basically a chief minister running the day-to-day administration, working alongside the brilliant Persian Barmakid family. And what's super fascinating here is that this highly centralized structure in Baghdad would actually serve as a direct blueprint for the later Ottoman Empire's administrative framework. The Ottomans similarly relied on powerful viziers and super complex bureaucracies to sustain governance over their vast territories centuries down the line.
All of this immense wealth and stability allowed for some truly incredible cultural patronage. The ultimate symbol of this? The Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. Now, this wasn't just some local library. It was a massive translation and research institute right in Baghdad. Scholars there actively collected and preserved global knowledge, works by Aristotle and Galen that Christian Europe was basically ignoring at the time. And much like the later Ottoman patronage of architectural and literary guilds, this deep investment in culture is exactly what fostered long-term social stability. It quite literally turned Baghdad into the intellectual center of the world.
Now, what's absolutely phenomenal here is that these scholars weren't just passively translating dusty old books. No way. They were pioneering entirely new fields of human knowledge. Look at al-Khwarizmi. He didn't just study math, he literally invented algebra. He's actually the reason we have the word algorithm. Then there's Ibn Sina, who authored the Canon of Medicine, moving way past superstition to actually identify transmission vectors for diseases. And Ibn al-Haytham? He reinvented the camera obscura and formulated an actual scientific method centuries, literally centuries before Galileo. We are talking about monumental original scientific breakthroughs here.
But science wasn't their only export. The Abbasids were absolute economic titans. Positioned perfectly astride the Silk Roads, they linked Europe and Asia. They were moving revolutionary goods like glazed pottery, Chinese paper-making techniques, and even fresh food packed in ice. It's like a massive global highway. And while the later Ottomans would eventually have to adapt their economic strategies, shifting toward naval trade routes and European banking as overland Silk Roads declined, the Abbasid mastery of these vast overland networks is what heavily funded those intellectual pursuits we just talked about and sustained their early global dominance.
But nothing lasts forever, right? Let's move to our next section, state fragility and shifts in military loyalty.
So the structural flaw that ultimately undid the Abbasids is brilliantly illustrated by how their military evolved. Initially, their army was this loyal, traditional mix of Arab and Persian citizen troops. But over time, seeking an elite, unquestioningly loyal bodyguard, the Caliph started purchasing Turkish slave soldiers from the Central Asian steppes. These were known as Mamluks. Well, this proved to be a fatal error. These Turkish officers became so militarily dominant that they literally started assassinating caliphs, sparking a decade of anarchy. Military loyalty completely shifted, and suddenly mighty caliphs were just figureheads, mere puppets for Turkish warlords. It's a structural fragility that, interestingly enough, would also plague the Ottomans much later, when their own elite forces, the Janissaries, repeatedly rebelled against the sultans.
Just to give you a sense of how terrifying these soldiers were, the contemporary writer Al-Jahiz wrote this: "If 1,000 of their horsemen are hard-pressed, they will loose all their arrows in a single volley and bring down 1,000 enemy horsemen." I mean, wow. That terrifying, lethal efficiency is exactly why the caliphs bought them in the first place. But that exact same efficiency is what made the Turkish military elite completely unstoppable when they finally decided, you know what, we're taking political control of Baghdad for ourselves.
Which brings us to our final section, the transition to dissolution.
The absolute political end of the Abbasids happened incredibly abruptly and violently in 1258, when the Mongols under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. The Caliph ignored the warnings, and it resulted in the utter destruction of the city. The House of Wisdom, destroyed. The Caliph himself, executed. Political power was completely crushed. Yet, and this is a huge yet, ceremonially, the bloodline and that religious title of Caliph actually survived in Egypt as figureheads. The ceremonial role lasted all the way until 1517, which is when the absolute last Abbasid Caliph peacefully surrendered the title over to the rising Ottoman Empire.
Now, tracking this territorial and administrative decline reveals two totally different ways to lose an empire. The Abbasid political height, as we just saw, violently collapsed in 1258. When the Ottomans absorbed that spiritual title later in 1517, they utilized a very similar centralized, bureaucratic structure. They even used their own military elite, the Janissaries, which were basically structural cousins to the Abbasid Mamluks. But the Ottomans managed a much slower transition from their absolute height. They adapted their administrative and economic strategies over time, leading to an ultimate gradual dissolution in 1918 after the First World War. It's a stark contrast in how power transitions.
So what does this all mean? It brings us right back to our starting point and this absolutely vital question. Is human history truly divided into East and West? The whole story of the Abbasids, their preservation of Greek philosophy, inventing modern math and medicine, running these vast global trade networks, it shows us how deeply interconnected the world has literally always been. The whole idea of an exotic, entirely separate East is basically an Orientalist construct. It was designed to divorce these monumental achievements from the overarching story of human progress.
I want to leave you with this really provocative thought. The Arabs weren't doing something that was alien to them. They were part of Western civilization. When the Abbasids translated Aristotle, when they were literally inventing algebra, they were actively participating in and advancing the very core of what we now claim as Western heritage. History isn't just some segregated timeline of East versus West. It's a deeply intertwined shared inheritance. If the Dark Ages were just a flawed historical premise, and the East was actually keeping the engine of civilization running this whole time, what else have we been mistaught about our shared history? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.